At this point, every information portal is saturated with mindfulness content. But this show is a unique, unusual, curious take on mindfulness. Some of what you hear will be completely new to you. Let's dive in and take a look at the nature of the aware mind. I invite you to deepen your awareness so that you may be liberated and inspired. I'm Sarah Vallely, professional coach. I help people overcome anxiety, heal from past trauma, improve their relationships, and maintain better work-life balance. Hello and welcome. The show today is going to be about the inner voice. Specifically, it's going to be about a book called Chatter. So every so often, I do an episode that is a book review. And so this is a book review episode. And so it's just me. I don't have a guest today. I tend to gain new listeners when I publish book review episodes because I get a lot of downloads. So the book that I'm going to be reviewing today is called Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It. This book was published in 2021, and it's written by Ethan Kross. On Amazon, it has 4.5 stars with about 4,000 reviews. On Goodreads, it has a rating of 4 stars out of 5 with 18,605 votes. Seems to be a book that people like. I enjoyed many things about this book that I will share with you. The author, Dr. Kross, has a PhD in psychology. He is a professor and researcher at University of Michigan. So it's so nice to read books written by researchers. You can really get some valuable conclusions from their research. He studies how the conversations people have in their heads impact their health, impact their performance, their decisions, and their relationships. He is also an expert in neuroscience, and he's pretty cute. But ladies, he is married. He has 2 kids. I want to begin by defining a few terms that are going to be really important to this book and this review. One is inner voice. What does that mean? I'm sure you've heard that term a ton of times. This is what inner voice means. Anytime you hear yourself talk in your head without speaking it out loud. That's it. It's that simple. Whenever we are talking in our head, but we are not saying it out loud. Another term I want to define is self-talk. So this is the same as inner voice. However, we usually don't use it in a neutral way. So when we use this word self-talk, we are usually meaning that self-talk is helpful or it's harmful. It's positive or it's negative, it's critical or it's compassionate. So usually when we use the term self-talk, we are talking about positive self-talk or negative self-talk. Chatter, the name of the book, I thought I should define that just in case, is talking rapidly without breaks about irrelevant topics. So if we have our inner chatter, I'm sure we've experienced that quite a bit. Talking rapidly in our heads without taking a break about something pretty irrelevant. And rumination is the last word I would like to define. And rumination is repetitive thinking or dwelling on the causes and consequences of something you did or something that happened. So when I think about the word rumination, and many other people in the field, we think about this as something about the past. We're ruminating about something in the past. We are replaying something that happened in our heads, and we are making judgments about it, conclusions, and so forth. I have to say, something that can be really helpful about understanding rumination is that, and this is not from the book, this is just something that I believe and I teach, is that at the root of all rumination is emotion. So one way to get yourself out of the rumination cycle is to move into the emotion, really identify what is that deeper emotion that is causing you to ruminate. So the first part of this book explains how the inner voice is used on a psychological level and on a neuroscience level. I'm going to lay out a few things for you to help understand that. And some of this actually isn't in the book. This is a little bit of background information to help you understand the psychological and neuroscience processes of the inner voice. So I want to start with something called the educational psychology model for information. Again, this is not in the book, but I think this is something that is going to really pull all this together. The educational psychology model for information processing goes like this. What happens when we are out and about and we hear somebody speak, whether we are in a classroom or we are listening to a YouTube video or we are in a conversation with someone? The sensory information comes in first. So the sensory information is the sound of the person's voice, is the expressions on their face. That would be the visual sensory information. The sound of their voice would be the auditory sensory information. Then what happens is we contemplate this information in short-term memory. We question it. We make connections to things we already know. We gain some new understanding. So we do this while we are working with it in short-term memory. Then after that, some of the information is lost, and then some of the information goes into long-term memory where we can retrieve it later. If you are in school to be a teacher, they go over this process quite a bit, and they teach teachers to create scenarios where children are in this contemplative phase because that's where the learning happens. And a brain center used in this process is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for a lot of things, but in this particular scenario, some of the things are storing memories of personal experiences, retrieving memories about personal experiences, and retrieving words and concepts and numbers and so forth. So this is all going to make sense because the inner voice is tied into this learning process. In fact, we wouldn't be able to do this learning process without the inner voice. And that's one of the big points that Kross is making in the first part of his book. And I know I'm geeking out a little bit, but I'll tell you what, the book is even more geeky. So I am dumbing it down a little bit. This book is definitely good for people who work in the field of mental health, are coaches like myself. I mean, this is what I do all day, is help people understand their inner voice and work with their inner voice. So it's a very good book for somebody who's in the field. For a layperson, this book may be great if you like sciencey type books. If you don't, this might not be the best book for you, but I'm going to really highlight the really key points in this book so you'll get this information without reading the book. So another little geeky term that Kross uses in the book is called the phonological loop. And this is key for understanding the inner voice. There is something called our inner ear, and this is not the inner ear as in our physical inner ear. You go to the ear doctor, they look at your inner ear. There's another inner ear that is psychological. And what this inner ear does is it stores what you just heard for 1 to 2 seconds. There's this part in our brain, there's this process in our brain that stores what we just heard for a few seconds, basically so we can process it. So we can contemplate it, so we can ask questions about it. The inner ear is part of the phonological loop. So this is a psychological process. Another part of the phonological loop is the inner voice. And what the inner voice does is it asks questions, it makes comments based on what you just heard. This is key to learning new information. So this phonological loop, this inner ear, and this inner voice are used during that working memory phase of the education psychology model for learning. And what this phonological loop does is it helps us process information in the moment. So we might be listening to a podcast, we might be watching a video, we might be reading a book, we might be in a conversation with someone, and our inner ear is holding what we just heard for a few seconds, and then our inner voice is responding to it. So let's try this. Let's try it right now. I'm going to say a sentence. And while I do that, I want you to notice 3 things. The one thing, I want you to notice a storing of what I said for a few seconds. It takes quite a bit of mindfulness to notice that. I also want you to notice your interaction with what I say in your own mind, and notice what you might say to yourself. So you might say to yourself, I wonder if that's true for me. How do you even find that out? That is really hard to believe. just a few examples of maybe some of the comments or questions you might say to yourself while you're processing in the moment the sentence that I'm about to read. So here's the sentence. Our inner voice is much more rapid compared to our outer voice. What we might say aloud in a day, we say in an hour with our inner voice. So what was that like for you? Well, maybe you're still processing it in this moment. So why is this all so important? Why did Dr. Kross spend so much time in the beginning of the book outlining some of this information that I'm sharing with you now? It's important because this is where the inner voice comes from. This is the basis of it. This is the reason we have an inner voice, is because of the phonological loop. Have you ever just walked around and said, I wonder why I have this inner voice? Well, there you go. Phonological loop. So the original use of this process, our inner voice, is to contemplate and learn and understand. And I've got a question for you. What if we did not have this ability to contemplate before information goes into our long-term memory? What if we just heard something and it goes right into our long-term memory and forms our beliefs? What if we didn't have this ability to contemplate first? We'd be totally brainwashed all the time, right? We wouldn't have an evaluation system to be able to decide for ourselves whether this is something that we want to take on, believe in, make part of our understanding. I'd love to write a book called Using Your Mind as God Intended. Not a religious book, nothing like that, but I'd love to look at the original use for psychological processes and then look at how we are using them kind of incorrectly in ways that are causing stress, causing worry, causing depression. So an example is rumination. Originally, rumination was used to help our ancestors learn from their mistakes and live, not die, basically. So you can think of your ancestor saying something like this. I saw the tiger. I didn't run right away. I paused, almost got bit, almost got eaten. That was close. Next time, I'm going to run away more quickly. Right. So that is an example of ruminating, reflecting on something that happened in the past, evaluating it, and making a decision about how to maybe do it differently next time. That is the real reason for rumination. There's a reason for it. But what's happening now in today's day, we are ruminating about things that weren't necessarily dangerous in the first place, maybe ruminating about things that we don't really need to learn from. Maybe instead of ruminating, we need to give ourselves grace and compassion. So same thing with the inner voice, right? I just explained how this inner voice originated, what it was created to be used for, but are we using it in ways that's not that intention, that's not that helpful? Are we using the inner voice to put ourselves down, criticize ourselves, put pressure on ourselves, tell ourselves to stop feeling our feelings because maybe that's weak and we don't want to be weak? The list goes on and on. So the next part of this book is really focused on, do we use our inner voice in a constructive way or do we use it in a deconstructive way? That's basically the gist of the whole book. And this is all very important because, as Kross says, the research shows that what we are thinking, our inner voice, what we are thinking is a better predictor of our happiness than what is actually going on in our life. So I'm going to say that again. Our thinking is a better predictor of our happiness than what is going on in our life. And research shows that. What's more, Kross tells us about someone who had a near-death experience. And during this near-death experience, their inner voice just shut off. So I don't really know the neurology behind that. He didn't get into it, but that's what happened. And this person reported that it was so absolutely relieving. Like the stress, the anxiety, all that just went away when this person basically lost their inner voice temporarily. If we can quiet our mind, use some mindfulness to still our thinking, we can feel more fulfilled. We can feel happier, all those things. Here are a few ways that Kross says our inner voice can cause issues and not be helpful. So one of them is it interferes with your ability to focus and plan. So what he means by that is when we use our inner voice, it makes executive functioning more difficult. So our prefrontal cortex we use to plan, to make decisions, to process. And if we're using our inner voice quite a bit, it's actually taking up bandwidth in our brain, and we're not able to use the functions that I just listed in your prefrontal cortex, which are needed for executive functioning. So if you want to get more organized, you want to get more focused, working with your inner voice is a really great way to do that. I'll just put a plug in there for mindfulness. Mindfulness is a great way to do that. Another way that Dr. Kross says the inner voice causes issues is it can lead to more anger. He says that inner chatter can cause people to vent more than if they were a little bit more quiet with their inner voice. And he said that ruminating, using this inner voice in that way, in a very critical way, can actually cause people to be more aggressive. And he said that this rumination can cause people to displace their anger on others more instead of the alternative, which would be to take a look at, what's going on a deeper level. What is that pain? There's always pain under anger. What is that emotional component for you? And another way that Dr. Kross says our inner voice can cause issues, and brace yourself for this. This is a big one. You may or may not be able to swallow this one, but this is what he says, that our inner voice can affect the genes that are activated in our DNA. Whoa, mind blown. Hey, I believe it. I do. I read a book called Biology of Belief years ago, and by Dr. Bruce Lipton, and it explained this and how this works. There's research. So what do? Dr. Kross spends the last part of the book explaining how to overcome these obstacles, these negative things that can happen when we use our inner voice too much. And Kross says that distancing ourselves from our inner voice is what helps this. And mindfulness is similar because that's what we're doing in mindfulness. We're actually distancing ourselves from our thinking. We are learning how to not identify with the thoughts. Instead, we just see the thoughts as phenomenon of the brain, and we don't believe them all. We don't get caught up in them all. They just kind of come up and disappear. But what I'm going to explain as far as technique that Kross shares in the book is not necessarily mindfulness. It is distancing, but not in this specific technique of mindfulness. So he uses the terms mental distancing and psychological distancing, meaning the same thing. And the difference between mindfulness and this mental distancing is mindfulness, we kind of stop interacting with the thinking. We don't get involved with it. With mental distancing, you're still involved in the story that your thinking tells. You're just doing it from a distance. So there's several ways that he explains how to do this. So I'll go over them. Maybe you'll find some of them interesting and you'll want to try them. So one technique for mental distancing is imagine what happened to you happening to a friend instead, and then looking at it from that perspective. So you're you, and then you're imagining what happened to you happened to one of your friends, and then you're thinking about how you might approach that situation, whatever happened, as if it happened to one of your friends. So here's an example. Say you're looking for a job and you interviewed for a position that you're really interested in, and then you got a call, and then you followed up and found out you didn't get the position. So that's a difficulty. Difficulties like that can bring on a lot of negative self-talk, to be honest. So instead of going that route, Dr. Kross is saying, imagine that it was your friend who had the interview and didn't get the job. And how would you think of that scenario if it were your friend? Well, instead of beating yourself up or moving into depression, you might simply think, well, I'm sure she did a great job in the interview. Unfortunately, they just had probably a lot of candidates and she didn't get that position, but that just means there's another perfect position coming up around the corner, right? So that shift, that distancing can give you the perspective that's going to be more healthy. Another suggestion he gives for this mental distancing is researching your ancestry and seeing what problems they faced, which were probably a lot. I mean, I have heard the stories about my past relatives going through the depression and how hard that was. And the idea of this technique is then to see that maybe your problems aren't as big compared to what some of your ancestors went through. I don't know, try it out. Another technique is imagining how your future self will think about the problem you're facing. That's supposed to give you a more healthy perspective. Journaling is another way to create that distance. Writing the words out on the paper, you begin to distance yourself a bit from the scenario. This is kind of a fun one. Visualize yourself far away, possibly in the sky, looking down on you and your challenge. So just float up there into space, look down on Earth, look at your itty bitty life in your itty bitty house with maybe your itty bitty problems. So you can try that out. And then a last technique I'll share, and this is a technique that I use in coaching. I call it proxy. But this technique involves you imagining what someone thinks about your problem. And this someone is a person who you look up to, you trust. So it's your proxy. And this person can be a celebrity. It can be someone in your family who you really look up to. Really can be anyone. And just imagine, use your inner voice to say what this person might say about your problem. Maybe it's good advice. Maybe it's a pep talk. Maybe it's something compassionate. That's a really nice technique. So one of the things I love about this book is it is based in research. Dr. Kross references a ton of studies. One in particular went like this. The researchers stood in New York City and asked random people if they would walk around with a recorder and record everything they were thinking. So they would be out there at a corner in New York City somewhere. They'd have a recording device with a microphone and they would give it to these random people, and the people would go off by themselves. They might walk through a park, just take a half hour, an hour, and just everything that their inner voice said, they inputted into the recorder. And so what they did with the study is then they analyzed all the recordings of what people were thinking and determined what types of thinking were helpful and what types of thinking were harmful. So I think that's where they got a lot of these ideas for how to shift your perspective with your inner voice and speak innerly in a way that's more helpful. He spent a lot of time going over this one particular technique, which is research. I think maybe he researched it. This is some of his own research. And what this technique is, brace yourself again, this is a little bit weird, but let's take it seriously. This technique is speaking to yourself using your name. He says this works because it creates some distance, as in the other mental distancing techniques. I actually disagree. I don't disagree that this works. I know that this works, but I think if your inner voice uses your name, it's helpful because it gets your attention. I think that's one of the biggest challenges of working with your inner voice is getting its attention, if you can think about it that way. So here's some ways that you can do this. When you're journaling, write in you language. You are feeling this way. You are thinking this thought. Sarah, you are really wanting it to work out this way. Da 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 da. So that's one way. And then the other way is, with your actual inner voice, not your journaling, talking to yourself using your name. Sarah, I can see you are feeling hurt. Sarah, you are loved. Sarah, you are worthy. I haven't actually tried this yet. It is weirding me out a little bit, but I know it works. And I really do need to start using it more and start teaching it to my clients. For now, I use the I language, and that's some of the language that I help my clients with when they're using their inner voice in a way that's helpful. But he does say that you is distance language and that I is immersive language, where you're more immersed in it. That's the big highlights in the book, the big takeaways that I had. I think it was a really good book. I do think it was a little bit heady and sciencey, but I did gain a lot of good information from it and things that I will implement into my life and working with clients. Here's a few random notes I took, and I'll share them in case you find them interesting. One of the things he said about our problems and determining whether our problems are a challenge or are they stress? He said that if you have the resources, then it's a challenge. But if you have this problem and you don't have the resources, then it becomes stress. So that could be helpful to just take a pause, take a moment, and ask yourself, do I have all the resources? And if you do, then you can reframe the situation in your mind that this is a challenge. This is a challenge that I can meet and I can overcome. Or if you determine that you don't have all the resources, then you can be reminded that this is a situation that can really cause some stress. And so it's good to follow up with techniques to help you de-escalate that stress. He also brought up the term co-rumination. He said this is when we talk to a friend in a way that's not beneficial, kind of like venting, and not that there's anything wrong with venting, but kind of going down this road of kind of this negative talk, but you're doing it with a friend, and that's co-rumination. So I thought that was interesting. I've never heard that term before. He also said that physical affection can help with the inner voice, and especially if it's in negative self-talk. So that's good to remember. And lastly, he invited us as readers to reinterpret our body as helpful instead of not helpful when we are stressed or facing some difficulty. So I think that's an interesting concept. So that means that we are upset about something and we notice that our stomach is really tight and uncomfortable, and we can be doubly frustrated because now our body is involved and it doesn't feel good. Or, as Dr. Kross is suggesting, that we actually see the positive side of our body reacting in that way. And so maybe it is that your stomach is tight because this is a stressful situation. And knowing that, again, you can take a pause and say, okay, this is a stressful situation. This is difficult for me. Acknowledging the difficulty of the situation, which can set you up for self-compassion or other techniques that are going to help you reduce your stress. I hope that was helpful. That is my book review for Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters and How to Harness It. You can find it as an audio book on Audible. You can find it in hard copy, paper book, Kindle, all the ways. And maybe you want to read the book, or maybe you just want to take what you learned here on this episode and implement it right away without actually reading the book. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend. It's always nice to gain new listeners. The Aware Mind podcast is a TSD Mindfulness production. Please check out our show notes for upcoming events and links to additional resources. Please visit our website at tsdmind.org. That is T as in tame, S as in soothe, D as in dwell, mind as in mindfulness.org. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at TSD_mindfulness.